Today, I'm going to tell you a story so cruel it will make your chest tighten, set deep in the unforgiving American West. A land of snow-covered roads, silent towns, and laws written by powerful men instead of justice. It was a place where one wrong name could decide whether you lived or froze to death. It all began with a single lie, small enough to be spoken in one breath, yet strong enough to destroy an innocent life. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. They didn't know that the tall white manor overlooking the valley, known as the Valick residence, was not lit by kindness or welcome, but by a simmering fury that never cooled. Those who lived close enough to hear the muffled shouting behind the thick velvet drapes understood the truth. They knew that behind those spotless walls, a quiet war was being fought against a young woman named Avelyn Crowin. She was 22 years old, slender as a young branch, yet bent beneath too many seasons of cruelty. She was not the daughter of that house, not in the way society counted such things. She was an orphan taken in by Judge Ormond Valick, a man who wore authority like armor polished daily. But Avelyn understood early on that she had not been brought there out of mercy. She was a living reminder of a buried family disgrace, a mistake born at the wrong moment, under the wrong circumstances. And the judge made certain she remembered that truth each morning. Long before dawn brushed gold across the plains, Avelyn was already awake. Her hand stayed cracked from scrubbing floors that were already spotless. Her back stiffened from hauling water through long, echoing hallways. She moved through the house like a shadow, careful not to be seen, careful not to breathe too loudly. Breakfast hours were the hardest. Selma Valick, the judge's wife, would sit at the heavy walnut table sipping steaming coffee while Avelyn worked around her. Selma's face was sharp as a hatchet edge, and her words cut just as clean. She would tap her porcelain cup slowly, eyes narrowing as she watched the girl polish silver that would never belong to her. "Look at you," she'd say coldly, her lip curled. "Thin as fence wire and twice as useless. Who would ever choose to raise the likes of you? If it weren't for the judge's patience, you'd be starving in a ditch." Avelyn kept her gaze lowered. She'd learned long ago that answering back only invited worse. And in the Valick household, trouble usually wore the face of Redden Valick. Redden was 30, broad-built, and cruel in the lazy way of men who had never once faced consequence. He'd swagger into the kitchen near noon, breath reeking of sour whiskey. Every time his eyes landed on Avelyn, a twisted smile spread across his face. "Well now," he'd mutter, "look who's still breathing." He'd seize her arm just hard enough to leave marks she'd later hide beneath long sleeves. "Don't think the world owes you air, girl." Sometimes he shoved her against the counter. Other times he yanked her hair simply to watch her flinch. Selma never stopped him, and Judge Valick never cared enough to see. To the town, Ormond Valick remained a pillar of law, boots polished, coat pressed, gray hair kept neat and severe. The Dustmere folk respected him without question. But inside, the man had rotted hollow. They believed him firm and righteous. Avelyn knew better. He despised her for existing. His resentment shaped every silence between them. He never shouted, never needed to. His quiet carried its own violence. His eyes were colder than creek water in winter. Avelyn had stopped crying years ago. Pain became familiar, like the groan of old stairs beneath her feet. The ache of her days carved her down until dreaming felt useless. Hope became a thing she no longer recognized. She survived. That was all, until the night everything finally split open. Winter lay heavy over Dustmere when Redden returned from another night of gambling behind the livery stable. Cards, liquor, and debts he couldn't repay. The men he owed were not gentle collectors. He staggered home desperate, fear burning hot beneath his skin, and when he burst into the parlor and saw Avelyn dusting the mantel, he found his escape. He shouted her name, finger shaking as he pointed at her. It was her! The room froze. I saw her taking Father's gold pocket watch this morning, he barked. She's been stealing for months. I'd wager on it. He sneered. Probably got herself a little stash hidden somewhere. The feather duster slipped from Avelyn's numb fingers. I didn't, she whispered, her voice barely sound at all. Redden, you know I didn't. Before she could finish, Selma rushed across the room. You lying little whore, she screamed. Her palm struck Avelyn's face so hard the girl collapsed onto the hardwood floor. Ormond, Selma shrieked. Get in here! The judge appeared in the doorway, jaw clenched tight, eyes unreadable. She's been stealing, Redden said quickly, panic sharpening his voice. The judge did not ask how. He did not ask when. He did not ask for proof. He looked only at Avelyn, and in that gaze lived every ounce of hatred he had carried for years. His eyes remained dark, giving nothing away. She's been stealing, Redden Valick insisted, his voice sharp with panic. He was desperate now, clawing for any lie that might save him. I caught her myself, saw it with my own eyes. The judge did not ask how. He did not ask when. He did not demand proof. He didn't even glance toward his son. Instead, his gaze settled on Avelyn Crowin, the girl who embodied everything he despised about his past. You ungrateful curse, Judge Ormond Valick snarled. And then restraint vanished. His hand struck her, not once, not twice, again and again until the room spun, until copper flooded Avelyn's mouth and the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. From the corner, Selma Valick hurled venomous words, her voice sharp with satisfaction. While Avelyn lay curled on the floor, Redden drove his boot into her ribs. Then the judge seized her arm and dragged her through the house like refuse, her heels scraping against polished wood that had never once belonged to her. They reached the massive front door. You're finished here, he said flatly. There was no anger left in his voice, only finality. Get out of my house, take your filth with you. He shoved her into the night. The door slammed behind her, and the heavy deadbolt slid home with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. Avelyn tried to rise. Her legs gave way. Above the ridge, the sky bled into a bruised shade of pink as thin snow began to fall. Light, sharp flakes drifting down like ash. She wore nothing but her thin house dress. The cold struck instantly. Needle-sharp pain sliced through her battered skin. She crawled toward the road, breath tearing from her throat in ragged gasps. By the time she reached the fence line, her fingers were numb and useless. The warmth of the manor, the fires, the thick quilts, were gone forever. The only thing that house had ever truly given her was the heat of its hatred. She collapsed beside a twisted old cottonwood, half buried in snow. Her vision dimmed, the world fading to gray at the edges. Her heartbeat slowed, pounding dully in her ears. A strange, frightening calm settled over her. Maybe this is the only mercy the world has left for me, she thought. Her eyes closed as snow gathered over her like a burial shroud. She waited for the end. But the story did not end in the snow, because fate, especially on the frontier, rarely arrives with thunder. It came instead with the rattle of wagon wheels grinding across frozen ground. Avelyn's awareness drifted, thin as smoke on the wind. She didn't hear the horse at first, didn't notice the creak of leather or the low breath of an animal fighting the cold. Then a voice cut through the storm, not a man's shout, but a woman's firm, commanding call. Whoa there, easy now. Boots crunched through the crusted snow. A moment later, hands were on her. Warm, rough, solid. A face hovered above her, framed by a heavy wool hood. It was a face shaped by years of sun and sorrow, lined by hard horizons and harder losses. This was Ma Fenwick. The Dustmere folk knew her as the widow who ran Double Creek Ranch alone, since her husband never returned from the war between the states. She was known for her sharp tongue, her worn Bible verses, and the grief she carried as openly as her black coat. "Good Lord," she breathed. "Child," Maud murmured, brushing ice from Avelyn's cheek. "What have they done to you?" Avelyn tried to speak, to warn her that she was worthless, unwanted, but her lips only trembled. Maud didn't wait for answers. She didn't ask who was guilty. She simply unfastened her heavy buffalo hide coat and wrapped it around Avelyn's shaking body. With strength that defied her years, Maud lifted her from the snow as though she weighed no more than a bundle of dry wheat. "You're coming with me," Ma Fenwick said, her voice firm enough to end all argument. "No soul deserves to freeze alone on a night like this." The wagon ride became a blur of jolts and pain. Every rut in the frozen trail sent fresh fire through Avelyn Crowin's battered ribs. She drifted in and out of awareness, held in place only by Maud's arm wrapped tightly around her, anchoring her to the living world. By the time the wagon left the main road, the storm had settled into a quiet, steady fall. Ahead, Double Creek Ranch stretched beneath the moonlight. It was a place past its prime, fences leaning slightly off true, a barn with weathered boards and peeling paint, and silence, so much silence. Once, the ranch had echoed with cattle calls and laughter. Now it stood like a home holding its breath, waiting for a life that had slipped away years earlier. Maud reined the horses near the porch and helped Avelyn down. Avelyn paused at the bottom step, old fear clawing tight around her chest. "I shouldn't be here," she rasped, her voice breaking. "The judge—" "Hush now," Maud said gently. "You're cold. You're hurt. That's all the Lord needs to know, and that's all I need to know." She opened the front door. The sensation that rushed over Avelyn nearly dropped her to her knees. Warmth. Thick, radiant heat poured from a cast-iron stove roaring in the hall. The air carried the scent of pine resin, dried sage, and clean soap. It wrapped around her like a second blanket. Maud guided her into a sitting room lined with shelves of worn books and faded photographs. She eased Avelyn onto a cushioned chair, then moved briskly away. Moments later, she returned with a basin of hot water, clean cloths, and a bowl of stew rich with beef and potatoes. Avelyn stared down at it. Her hands shook so badly the spoon rattled against the ceramic. In the Valick house, she had never eaten until the family was finished. She survived on cold scraps, standing alone in the pantry. I'll spill it," she whispered, fear tightening her throat. She wasn't afraid of the mess. She was afraid of punishment. Maud sat beside her, her expression softening into something both fierce and motherly. "Then we'll clean it up," she said. "Don't fret, child. Eat." Avelyn lifted the spoon. Warmth slid down her throat, melting the ice that had lived in her chest for years. And then the tears came. She hadn't meant for them to, but the kindness struck deeper than any blow ever had. She cried silently, tears slipping into the stew. Maud didn't hush her, didn't tell her to stop. She simply rested a calloused hand against Avelyn's back and let her cry through the night. Later, Avelyn was shown to a guest room upstairs. It wasn't fine. The wallpaper curled in the corner, the floorboards groaned. But a lamp glowed on the bedside table, casting a circle of gold against the darkness. For the first time in her life, someone had turned down a bed for her. Yet the moment she would carry forever came, as Maud paused at the doorway. "Sleep well, Avelyn," she said. Then she turned the key. But she didn't lock the door from the outside to keep her in. She locked it from the inside, and placed the key gently into Avelyn's hand. A door meant to protect her, not imprison her. A barrier between her and the world that had tried to break her. The days that followed passed slow and quiet. Avelyn healed, though the bruises along her ribs darkened to deep purple before slowly fading to yellow. She tried to help, tried to sweep, to scrub, to earn her place, but each time Maud would calmly take the broom from her hands. "Sit," she'd say. The widow's voice would settle the matter without raising itself. "You've carried enough weight," Ma Fenwick would say. "Let this house carry you for a while." It was during those slow, hushed afternoons, when the winter sun slanted pale gold through the windows, that Maud first spoke his name. Avelyn Crowin was mending a tear in one of Maud's shawls, when the older woman paused and gazed toward the distant timberline. Something gentle crossed her weathered face, almost like fondness. "My partner will be coming down from the high country soon," she said softly, as if speaking more to memory than to the room. Avelyn looked up, startled. "Your partner?" "Jaik," Maud replied. "He runs trap lines up in the high pines, keeps the predators off the cattle through winter." Avelyn felt a flicker of unease. Is he a hard man?" Maud let out a dry, rasping chuckle. "The Dustmere folk think so. They cross the street when he walks into town. They see his blood, his size, and decide he must be a wolf." Her gaze returned to Avelyn, serious now. "But he's the only soul I trust to watch my back. He's a good man." She paused. "Just a lonely one." "Same as you." Avelyn didn't ask anything more, but the name settled in her thoughts like a seed dropped into soil. Jaik, a man the world feared, a man Maud trusted. She found herself staring out toward the snow-covered peaks, wondering what kind of life a man lived in the silence of the mountains, and whether something feared like a wolf could still be gentle. She didn't know it yet, but the storm that had carried her to Maud was nothing compared to the quiet force about to step through that door. The morning Jaik arrived at Double Creek Ranch, the sky lay overhead like hammered iron. Gray, unyielding. The wind howled through the eaves, making the timbers groan low and restless. Avelyn sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee, trying to draw warmth into her fingers. But the chill settled in her bones had nothing to do with the weather. Maud paused at her kneading board, flour dust clinging to her hands. She tilted her head, listening to something Avelyn hadn't yet noticed, the heavy, rhythmic thud of hooves striking frozen ground. "That'll be Jaik," Maud said, a small smile easing the deep lines of her face. She spoke his name the way one might speak of an approaching storm. Inevitable, powerful, but not to be feared. Avelyn's stomach tightened. She had heard his name murmured through the house for days. Sometimes Maud spoke it with pride, sometimes with something quieter, almost longing, as if that man was the last thread holding the ranch together. But Avelyn had no understanding of men who did not bring harm. In her world, heavy footsteps meant danger. They meant she should hide. She did not know what to make of someone who was actually expected. Moments later, the front door opened, sending a rush of wind and snow swirling across the floorboards. A figure stepped inside, ducking slightly beneath the frame. He wore a heavy buffalo hide coat that made him seem carved from the mountain itself, as though the high country had walked indoors. Jaik commanded the room without effort. He moved with deliberate quiet, as if unwilling to disturb anything that did not belong to him. He stood tall, shoulders broad from years of hauling timber and breaking trail. His features carried the sharp, weathered strength of his people. Strong jaw, high cheekbones, dark eyes that missed little. His black hair was tied at the nape of his neck, streaked with early gray that made him seem older than his years. Yet what struck Avelyn most was not his size. It was the stillness around him, a calm gravity that seemed to draw the air inward. "Good to have you home," Maud said warmly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Good to see you, Maud," he replied. His voice was low and steady, like distant thunder rolling through the hills. "I came as soon as the pass cleared." As he loosened his coat, his gaze drifted toward Avelyn. She froze, shrinking back instinctively against her chair. She braced herself for the sneer, for the hunger, for the cruel measuring look she had endured from Red and Valick for years. But Jaik did not look at her that way. His eyes were calm, observing, unjudging. There was no possession in his stare, no cruelty, no hunger at all, only awareness. He studied her the way a tracker studies unfamiliar ground, not with judgment, but with quiet attention, like reading a ridgeline or the bend of a river. He noticed the fading bruises along her cheek. He saw the way her breath caught before every word. Then he gave a small nod. "Ma'am," he said softly. "Avelyn," Maud Fenwick said, stepping between them, easing the space. "This is Jaik." She turned slightly. "Jaik, this is Miss Avelyn Crowin. She'll be staying with us for a spell." Jaik inclined his head. "Miss Crowin." Avelyn folded her hands together to hide the trembling. "Sir," she whispered. They gathered around the oak table for coffee. Jaik didn't speak much. He answered Maud's questions plainly, offering words only when they carried weight. He listened more than most folks ever tried to speak. Through the gaps in conversation, Avelyn learned he lived alone in a cabin high among the pines, running trap lines, cutting timber, sometimes digging silver when the ground allowed. He lived inside a silence so deep most people would drown in it. "At times," he said quietly, staring into his black coffee, "a man can lose himself if he stays too close to what the world expects." He paused. "I prefer the quiet." Avelyn watched him over the rim of her cup. She saw the shadow behind his eyes, a muted ache that lingered like winter fog. Maud had told her, in hushed tones, that Jaik had once been married. Years earlier, his wife had died of lung fever. Grief had carved him in ways unseen from a distance, but unmistakable once you stood near. Later that afternoon, Avelyn stepped onto the porch to shake out a rug. She didn't realize Jaik was nearby until she turned and spotted him beside the stable, repairing a bridle strap. His hands moved with calm precision, steady despite the cold. He didn't look up when he spoke, but his voice carried clearly through the wind. "You're afraid of me." Avelyn nearly dropped the rug. She clutched it to her chest like armor. I'm not." "It's all right," he said, tightening the buckle, the leather creaking beneath his grip. "I've seen fear before, Miss Crowin." He paused. "I know what causes it, and I know the kind of men who leave it behind." Avelyn swallowed, her throat dry. "I don't mean to be rude, Mr. Jaik." He sat back on his heels and finally met her gaze. His eyes were dark, steady, and unexpectedly gentle. "You're not being rude," he said. "You're being careful." Then he added, "But I want you to understand something." He held her eyes, not pressing, just offering truth. "I don't want anything from you. Not now, not ever, unless you choose to give it." He let the words rest between them. "I take nothing that isn't freely given, Miss Crowin. That is my vow." The sentence settled deep within her, warmer than the fire in Maud's parlor. Freely given. The idea left her dizzy. All her life she had believed she owed the world everything, her work, her silence, even her dignity. The thought that nothing was demanded of her felt both relieving and terrifying. "I don't understand anything anymore," she admitted softly. "Then let it unfold," he replied, turning back to his work. No one was chasing her here. But beyond the ranch, the world did not rest so quietly. That evening after supper, the mood around the table shifted. The lamps were turned low. Maud folded her napkin with a slow sigh. "Jaik," she said gently. "We need to talk about Avelyn." Avelyn froze beside the stove, dish rag clenched in her hand. Jaik didn't look up from the cedar he was shaping, but his hands stilled. "The judge was in town today," Maud said, tension tightening her voice, "asking questions. He knows she didn't disappear into the snow by chance. He's looking for her." She hesitated. "And he's angry. If he finds her here, a widow and a lone woman can't stand against the law, even when the law's rotten." Jaik studied the axe handle in his hands, thumb tracing the grain. "He won't stop," he said simply. "Men like Judge Ormond Valick don't accept losing what they believe belongs to them." "She needs somewhere he won't think to look," Maud said quietly. "Somewhere the law doesn't reach so easily." Silence settled heavy between them. Avelyn Crowin's heart hammered painfully against her ribs. She was going to be sent away. She felt it in her bones. She was a burden. A risk. Then Jaik lifted his head. His gaze crossed the dim room and found hers. "If she's willing," he said, his voice solid as stone, "I'd like her to come with me to the High Pines." "To the cabin?" Maud asked quietly. The room seemed to tilt around Avelyn. "To live with you?" Jaik shook his head once. "Not as a servant, not as someone who owes me, and not as a wife." He rose to his feet but didn't move toward her, leaving her space. "I need a life that belongs to me," he said, away from the town's eyes. "But no one should have to stand alone forever." He glanced at Maud. "She's right. You need safety." Then his eyes returned to Avelyn. "I can give you that. A roof, a fire." He paused. "And a loaded rifle by the door. No promises," he added gently. "No demands. If you choose to leave at any time, I'll bring you back myself." He inhaled slowly. "I only want to see if you can breathe easier under a quieter sky." It was the kindest and most frightening offer Avelyn had ever known. To ride into the wild with a man she barely understood. A man the Dustmere folk whispered about like a beast. But as she looked at him standing there with open hands and steady eyes, she realized something painful and true. The wolf was the only thing standing between her and the monsters she had fled. "I'll go," she whispered. And with that soft agreement, a new road opened before them, one leading straight into the spine of the mountains, where snow lay deep, and the only law was honor. The journey to the High Pines felt like climbing into another world. They rode higher with every mile, leaving the gray slush of the valley behind. The air thinned, sharpened, carrying the scent of ancient spruce. The cabin rested in a narrow hollow, tucked away like a secret the mountain chose to keep. It wasn't grand. A single-room structure of rough-cut logs, a stone chimney leaning slightly west, a narrow porch overlooking a drop so steep it made the stomach turn. Yet to Avelyn, seeing it for the first time, it was more beautiful than the Valick manor had ever been. Not because of its size, it was scarcely larger than the judge's pantry, but because nothing within those walls remembered raised hands or cruel voices. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and pipe tobacco. A handmade bed sat in the corner beneath a patchwork quilt. A small stove popped and hissed. Shelves held jars of dried beans and smooth river stones. "It's small," Jaik said, setting her trunk near the door. "But it's safe." Safe. That word again. Avelyn was still learning how to trust it. Her eyes drifted to the single bed, then back to him, panic fluttering in her chest. "There's only one bed," she whispered. Jaik didn't hesitate. "You take it. I'll sleep in the lean-to with the horses, or by the fire if the wind's too strong." "No," Avelyn protested, old instincts rising. "I can't put you out of your own home. I can sleep on the floor. I'm used to it." Jaik stopped her with a look. Not harsh, only steady. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I need that understood. You sleep in the bed. I sleep where I can watch the door. That's how it will be." And so life in the high pines began. The days settled into a rhythm Avelyn had never known in Dustmere. There, time had been measured in commands, floors to scrub, silver to polish, insults to endure. Here, time moved with the sun sliding across the floorboards. Morning began with the stove crackling to life. Jaik was always awake long before her. The smell of coffee already filled the small cabin when morning came. Jaik would hand her a tin cup of warm milk or dark brew before stepping outside to check his trap lines or ride toward the silver claim he worked down in the lower gorge. He never asked her to labor. He never demanded a hot meal when he returned. Yet Avelyn found she could not sit still, not from fear of punishment, but because work calmed the storm inside her. She swept the rough plank floors until the grain shone clean. She discovered his work coats, heavy canvas torn by briar and stone, and mended them in the window light, her stitches neat and careful. It became a quiet rhythm between them. Acts of care replaced words. He split the firewood so she wouldn't strain under the weight. She kept the stove burning so he would return to warmth. He hauled fresh water from the spring. She baked bread using the sourdough starter Ma Fenwick had tucked into her pack. They lived quietly, but never empty. And in that hush, something gentle began to take root. In the afternoons, when the sun turned the mountain snow to blinding white, the lessons began. Back at the ranch, Maud had packed a small book of poetry, Keats and Shelley, along with the supplies. Avelyn had never been allowed such things in the Valick house. Reading had been for the family, not for someone meant to serve. Here, she sat by the fire and read the verses aloud, her voice gaining strength with every page. Jaik would sit across from her, cleaning his rifle or oiling traps, listening with a focus that made her cheeks warm. He didn't know the poets, but he understood the world they spoke of. "Read that part again," he would say quietly, "the one about the wind." In return, he taught her the language of the mountain. He showed her the dried herbs stored in jars, willow bark for pain, yarrow to stop bleeding, sage to clear the spirit. He taught her how to read the stories pressed into the snow outside their door. "Here," he said one afternoon, kneeling in a drift. "The print's deep, long stride." "Elk," he said, moving fast, probably spooked by a cat higher on the ridge. Avelyn knelt beside him, tracing the mark with her finger. "How do you know it was a cat?" He lifted his gaze towards the trees. "Because the birds are quiet." "The mountain tells you everything," he said, "if you listen." He was teaching her how to survive. But more than that, he was teaching her that she belonged, not as a guest, not as a burden, but as part of the land itself. "You're learning quickly," he told her one evening, a rare smile touching his eyes. "I didn't know I could," she murmured, studying her hands. I was always told I was slow. Useless. You were told lies, Jaik said, his voice dropping to that low, steady rumble she felt more than heard. All you ever needed was a chance. Their eyes met, warm as the fire between them. Then he looked away, gently, giving the moment room to breathe. He was always careful with her, as though she were a startled deer that might flee if he moved too fast. But the true turning point, the moment Avelyn knew she had truly left Dustmere behind, came on a Tuesday. She was preparing supper, a simple meal, cornmeal batter for bread, and a rabbit stew from the game Jaik had brought in. Her attention drifted to the window, where a hawk circled the valley. She lost track of the heat. The sharp smell of burning hit her nose. Too late. Avelyn gasped, yanking the cast-iron skillet from the stove. The damage was done. The bottom of the cornbread was blackened, burned hard as coal. Smoke curled through the cabin. Panic struck cold and sudden, tightening around her throat. In the Valick house, a burnt meal had once meant no supper at all. It meant Selma Valick shrieking about wasted flour. It meant the sting of a backhand. Avelyn stood frozen, the skillet trembling in her grip. The door opened. Jaik stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. He paused, drawing in a breath. His eyes moved to the smoke curling near the ceiling, then to the blackened ruin in the pan, and finally to Avelyn, shrinking back against the wall. She braced herself. "I'm sorry," she blurted, tears burning her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I was watching the hawk and I'll fix it. I won't eat tonight. You take the stew, I'll—" Jaik crossed the room. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't raise his voice. He gently took the heavy skillet from her shaking fingers and set it on the table. Then he picked up a knife, scraped away the charred crust, and broke off a piece of the darkened bread. He popped it into his mouth, chewed slowly, thoughtfully. His face remained serious as he swallowed. Then he looked at her. "Well," he said, "it's got character." Avelyn blinked, stunned. "What?" "Crunchy," he added, a grin breaking free, unguarded, almost boyish. "I like it. Keeps the teeth sharp." A small sound escaped her throat, a startled giggle, then another. Relief burst loose, turning into laughter she couldn't stop. Jaik chuckled. And suddenly they were laughing together. She laughed until her sides ached, a sound she hadn't heard from herself since childhood. Tears streamed down her face. But they were warm this time. He stood there eating the burnt bread, smiling at her with a warmth that melted the last hard ice around her heart. In that small cabin, high above the world that had cast them both aside, Avelyn understood something she'd never dared before. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She wasn't hiding. She was living. Later that evening, as amber dusk settled behind the hills, Jaik stood on the porch watching the sky darken. Avelyn stepped out beside him, the boards creaking beneath her feet. "You all right?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Just thinking." After a pause, he added, "About whether this life is right for you, whether you're here because you want to be, or because it was the only door that opened." The wind tugged at her hair as she stepped closer. She didn't feel the cold. Only the man beside her, steady, honest, kind. "I don't know what I want yet," she admitted, "but I know I'm safer here than I've ever been." Jaik looked at her then, not with ownership, not with expectation, but with something like gratitude. "Then we'll keep building this life slowly," he said, "piece by piece, no rush, no demands." Avelyn nodded. For the first time, she believed him. She believed in tomorrow. But peace on the frontier is a fragile thing, easily shattered by the sound of hooves. Down in the valley, the snow began to retreat, clearing the roads for those who hunted. Not for meat, but for possession. Winter loosened its grip, and wolves wearing men's faces began to stir. Late spring came to the high pines not with silence, but with the roar of the creek bursting its banks. Meltwater turned the stream behind the cabin into white fury. Wildflowers followed, columbine and Indian paintbrush pushing up through thawing earth. For a few precious weeks, for a while, Avelyn Crowin allowed herself to believe the world below had forgotten her. But peace on the frontier is a brittle thing, easily shattered by men who believe they are owed what does not belong to them. It happened on a Tuesday. The air hung heavy with the scent of sun-warmed pine. Avelyn knelt beside the creek, scrubbing a tin pot with river sand, humming a tune Jaik had taught her. She didn't hear the riders at first. The water rushed too loudly. Jaik heard them. He stepped from the cabin, his body tightening, his gaze locking on the bend in the trail where a ribbon of dust rose against the blue sky. Avelyn straightened, wiping her wet hands on her apron. "Who is it?" she asked, though the cold hollow forming in her stomach already knew. "Trouble," Jaik said quietly. 4 riders broke from the tree line. At the front, sitting tall on a chestnut mare, rode Judge Ormond Valick. He wore a fine city coat that looked absurd against the raw timber and stone, but his face was exactly as Avelyn remembered, hard, superior, and empty of mercy. Beside him rode Sheriff Taven Crossley, his badge flashing cold in the sunlight. Behind them followed 2 Valick men, hands hovering close to their holsters. Avelyn staggered backward until her spine struck the cabin wall. The nightmare had climbed the mountain. The judge reined in his horse and surveyed the clearing with open disdain. "Well now," he called, his voice carrying that polished courtroom smoothness. "Ain't this a cozy little nest?" Jaik stepped off the porch. In his hands rested his hunting rifle. He did not raise it, not yet, but he held it with the easy certainty of a man who never missed. "You're far from your reach, Valick," Jaik said, his voice low and dangerous. "Turn around." The judge laughed, a dry, cracking sound. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Mr. Jaik. I've come to collect what belongs to me." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Jaik snapped, his jaw tightening, "and she isn't going anywhere." "Oh, but she is," Valick replied calmly. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a folded document, waving it like a blade. "This here is a lawful court order granting me full guardianship over Miss Crowin. The court has deemed her mentally unfit to care for herself." Avelyn's breath caught. "And as her legal guardian," the judge continued, "I have arranged a most advantageous marriage for her." He smiled thinly. "To Garrick Morvain." Jaik's blood ran cold. Morvain was a railroad magnate, 3 times Avelyn's age, a man rumored to have buried 3 wives and built his empire on cruelty and fear. The judge wasn't here to retrieve her. He was here to sell her. "She will not go," Jaik said, lifting the rifle's barrel a single inch. The sheriff stepped forward, hand resting on his revolver. "Now listen, son," Crossley warned. "This is lawful business. Interfere, and it's kidnapping." He let the word hang. "The sentence for that is hanging, and looking at you," his eyes swept over Jaik. "I doubt a jury would hesitate." The threat pressed heavy into the mountain air. Jaik did not move. He looked ready to die right there in the pine needles if it meant keeping her safe. Avelyn saw it in his stance, in his stillness, in the gray threading his dark hair. She saw the life he had built, the man who had taught her she was worth breath and warmth and choice, and with terrible clarity she understood. If he pulled that trigger, he would hang before the week was done. She could not let him be the price. "Stop." Her voice shook, but it carried. The word cut clean through the tension. Avelyn stepped away from the wall. "Put the gun down," she said. Jaik turned to her, disbelief and fear colliding in his eyes. "Avelyn, no." But she kept walking forward, because sometimes survival demands a different kind of courage. "I can stop them," Avelyn whispered. "They'll kill you." She moved past him and stopped just inches away, her back turned toward the judge. "I won't let you die because of me," she said softly. "I'm not worth that kind of blood." "You're worth everything," Jaik breathed fiercely. "Then let me save you this once," she replied, tears burning hot in her eyes. She turned slowly toward Judge Ormond Valick. "I'll go," she said. "Just leave him alive." The judge's mouth curved into a thin, victorious smile, cold and reptilian. "A sensible decision," he said. "Now get your belongings, girl." As Avelyn Crowin gathered her small bundle, her heart fractured with every step, Jaik remained on the porch, his rifle lowered, but his fists clenched so tight his knuckles bled white. When she passed him on her way to the judge's horse, he reached out and caught her wrist. The contact burned, desperate, electric. He didn't say goodbye. He leaned close, his breath warm against her ear, and whispered the 3 words she would cling to like a rope in a raging storm. "Watch the horizon." She mounted the horse the sheriff brought forward. Then they rode. She did not look back. She could not bear to see the wolf standing alone in the clearing, watching his heart ride away. 3 days later, the bells of the Dustmere church rang with a hollow, mournful toll. The Dustmere folk arrived in their Sunday finery, whispering behind gloved hands. A wedding was always spectacle, but a marriage between the judge's troubled ward and the richest man in the territory was scandal too tempting to miss. Avelyn stood in the vestibule, wrapped in a gown that cost more than she had earned in her lifetime. Heavy lace clawed at her skin. The collar pressed tight against her throat. White as a burial shroud. It didn't feel like a dress. It felt like a cage. Her face was bloodless, her eyes empty. She looked less like a bride and more like an offering laid out for slaughter. The organ groaned to life, a pompous, joyless march. The doors opened. Judge Valick gripped her arm, his fingers biting deep. A reminder of ownership. "Smile," he hissed. "You're saving this family." She walked the aisle. Faces blurred past her. She saw Selma Valick seated near the front, lips curved in smug satisfaction. She saw the groom, Garrick Morvain, waiting at the altar. A man with cold, damp eyes. Hands that looked as though they enjoyed breaking things. Avelyn reached the front. Pastor Halric Dorn began to speak, droning on about obedience and duty. The church air suffocated, thick with wilted lilies and stale incense. Her knees weakened. She closed her eyes, thought of mountain wind, of pine, of freedom. "Watch the horizon," he had said. "If anyone here has just cause why these two should not be joined." The words never finished. The double doors at the back of the church didn't open. They exploded. A thunderous crack tore through the sanctuary as wood shattered outward. Screams erupted. Men leapt from the pews. And there, framed in the ruined doorway, stood a vision torn from legend. A massive roan stallion reared on the threshold, iron shoes striking sparks from stone. Atop the beast sat Jaik. No longer the quiet man who mended fences. He was wind-scoured and feral, dust streaking his coat, his dark eyes burning with a fury that swallowed the room whole. Rifle in one hand, reins in the other. He looked like something summoned from an older world. "Jaik!" Judge Valick bellowed, his face turning purple. "Sheriff! Shoot him!" But Sheriff Taven Crossley stood frozen, staring straight down the barrel of Jaik's rifle. The stallion stepped into the nave, hooves clattering across the floor, sending a flower stand crashing aside. The Dustmere folk screamed and scrambled over pews, fleeing in blind panic. And the storm had arrived. Jaik rode straight down the center aisle. He ignored the chaos, ignored the screams. He didn't slow until he was barely 10 feet from the altar. He hauled the reins hard. The stallion snorted, hooves striking sparks against the floor as its head tossed. Jaik's gaze cut first to the groom, Garrick Morvain, crouched behind the pulpit like a frightened rat, then to Judge Ormond Valick, red-faced with fury, and finally to Avelyn Crowin. He didn't command her. He didn't reach for her. Instead, he lowered his hand, palm open, offering her the one thing she had never truly been allowed to have. "Choose," Jaik said. His voice carried over the shattered church, deep, unshaking, absolute. Time seemed to freeze. Avelyn looked at the judge lunging toward her. She looked at the wealthy tyrant waiting to claim her body and her name. Then she looked at the man who had burned his tongue on her cooking just to make her laugh. She did not hesitate. Avelyn grabbed fistfuls of the costly lace and yanked the skirt high. She kicked free of the satin shoes meant to bind her steps. She ran. She slipped past the judge's grasping fingers, dodged the stunned pastor, and leapt. Jaik caught her forearm with strength born of desperation and devotion, hauling her up behind him in one fierce, fluid motion. "Hold on," he shouted. She wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face into the rough wool of his coat. It smelled of pine, of horse sweat, of freedom. Jaik drove his heels into the stallion's sides. The horse spun, crashing through a row of hymn benches, then thundered straight back down the aisle. As they burst through the shattered doors into blinding sunlight, Avelyn heard the judge screaming behind them, but his voice sounded small, distant. They tore through the streets of Dustmere, leaving scandal, shame, and chains swirling behind in their dust. They rode toward open land, toward mountains, toward a horizon that finally belonged to them. The shouts of the Valick men dissolved into wind as Jaik guided the roan through twisting canyons only he knew, paths no badge or court order could follow. They did not stop until they reached a high ridge. Below them stretched the endless west, golden grass rolling like waves beneath the sinking sun. Only then did the fire in Avelyn's chest begin to ease. Jaik helped her down from the horse. He didn't scan for pursuers. He looked only at her. He cupped her face with rough, careful hands and brushed the dust from her cheeks. "No one owns you," he whispered, his voice steady as the land beneath their feet. "No one ever will again." And beneath a sky wide enough to hold every dream they had never dared speak, he kissed her. Not as a claim, as a promise. Seasons passed. The cabin in the high pines grew. One room added, a garden planted, laughter replacing silence. In time, the quiet nights were filled with the soft voice of a child they named Lyran. A daughter born not of fear, but of hope. The final image of Avelyn Crowin is not of a girl scrubbing floors. It is of a woman standing on her porch, watching the sun sink behind the mountains she chose. Beside the man who never let her be taken, she was no longer hiding. She was no longer surviving. She was free. And that's where we leave them. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Would you have taken that leap of faith? Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for giving your time to this story. Some journeys shape us, and we hope this one left a mark on your heart. There are more paths ahead, more legends of love, hardship, and redemption beneath the western sky. Please subscribe, leave your thoughts, and travel with us once again. Thank you, and God bless. Aviso legal/disclaimer. The stories presented here are creative expressions and may mix historical inspiration with dramatized scenes. AI tools contribute to some elements of voice, imagery, and structure, but every published story is refined by editors and creators to ensure authentic emotional impact. We honor YouTube's policies and do not generate deceptive likenesses or artificial depictions of real people. All audiovisual components are legally licensed. Any use, redistribution, or alteration of this content must be granted through written consent. Your presence here means a lot. Thank you for supporting artistic storytelling.